Hey guys, so welcome to the first episode of the Connected Realms podcast. This episode is going to be chapter 1 of the book Vampires Are by Stephen Kaplan. I'm going to do 8 episodes on this book, one per chapter. And what I'll do is go into detail about what each chapter discusses and then give you my thoughts on it. I'm not going to read this book word for word. I will read some passages word for word, but I'm just really going to try to give you the important information without reciting the entire thing as if it's an audiobook, because that's not what this is. So, this book was written in 1984 by Stephen Kaplan. It was written approximately 13 years after Kaplan started the Vampire Research Center in New York City in 1971. The first chapter is pretty quick and easy, so in effect, this episode of the podcast will also be pretty quick. So Kaplan starts off with this. Ask the average man or woman what a vampire is. When they stop laughing, they'll usually tell you it's a living dead creature, preferably with fangs, pale skin, hypnotic eyes, and a black open cape with red lining. It rises from its coffin at night to stalk innocent victims, and of course it has a heavy Transylvanian accent. I want to drink your blood. And Kaplan goes on to say, let's face it, any idea that we really have of vampires today doesn't really come from real life scientific research. It comes from myths, novels, legends, fictional accounts, movies, etc. But Kaplan sought to know what vampires really are if they do exist. And if they do exist, what do they look like? What's the difference between fact and fiction here? What do they do? What do their day-to-day lives entail, etc.? His research began in 1971 while he was studying legal and political anthropology. Now, if you're like me, you immediately ask, well, what the heck does one have to do with the other here? But what happened with Kaplan is he was beginning to make observations that many of the customs and rituals of primitive cultures that he was studying showed a striking similarity to vampire myths and legends. He also noticed that vampires actually appear in important texts throughout history, such as the Bible. So when he observed all these overlapping areas, he began to suspect that there may actually be a hint of truth here to the notion that vampires could have existed or could still exist today. He was saying, well, a lot of aspects of vampirism might be fictional, but there could be things here to actually uncover that are factual. So then he founded the Vampire Research Center, and he was joined by fellow academics from other fields such as anthropology, paleontology, sociology, psychology, and hematology. Now, I thought that was a really good mix of angles to approach this from. You have people pondering this from the academic perspective. Well, how is society thinking about this? Or the psychological perspective, what is a vampire like psychologically? So you have not only those soft sciences approaching this, but you have the hard scientific approach of hematology. And I believe as the years progressed, he was joined by other biologists because researchers came and went from the group, and some of those specialists left and were replaced with different specialists. So right off the bat, you learn that vampire researchers don't get any respect. Kaplan and his group were laughed at and harshly criticized because, look, they had to be the only legitimate research group conducting these studies into whether or not vampires actually exist and doing that research on real life people. So eventually, what they were able to devise was a very thorough questionnaire that had many in-depth questions, and they sent that out all over the US and received many responses. Of course, a lot of those were pranksters or people performing hoaxes, but Kaplan and his group began to categorize them, and so that first category is prankster/hoax. Second category is people who are vampire-like or who think they're vampires. So these are like your typical goth people where, they're filing down their teeth into fangs, they're dyeing their hair black, they're wearing black clothing. They might even, drink a little tiny bit of blood here and there, either because it's what they're into, for their own gratification, if you know what I mean, or they're in it to show off or entertain. But they don't truly depend on blood to get by, and they don't drink a large amount of it, and they don't have any other sort of medical anomalies going on. They just think that they're a vampire or they act like a vampire, but Kaplan and his group have said definitively, you're a human, you're not vampiric. Now, the third category is what the research group considers actual vampires, and we will get into how they define that as we go along throughout the rest of the book. So now we go into what those questions are on the questionnaire. Now, bear with me here because there actually are a lot of questions, and for the most part, I'm going to read this section of the book word for word. Kaplan says, how the VRC, the Vampire Research Center, categorizes interviews and examines alleged vampires. The following is a modified version of the methods used at the VRC. Because of the nature of these investigations, not everything can be revealed. Side note, that's a little bit frustrating. It's like, well, what aren't you revealing and why? But I'm sure they have their reasons. All right, he goes on to say telephone interviews. These callers are divided into two categories, pranksters and candidates for further review. Vampire attack reports. The questions for this are, where did the attack occur? When? How? To whom? Witnesses? Description of vampire. Description of wound, if any. Did the victim go to a doctor? Why not? What was the result? Did the police receive a report of an attack? When? Which precinct? The case number? Action? Or why no action? Why not report this to the police? We often receive vampire attack reports long after the actual attack occurred. This is really interesting, right? Like, say you think you got bitten by someone, whether or not you think it has anything to do with vampires, like, why wouldn't you immediately just go to the police or talk about it? It would be pretty strange that that would happen, especially if blood was drawn and you didn't at least tell the police. But so in terms of this Vampire Research Center, though, I mean, it was created in 1971. It didn't exist before then. And it took people a number of years, a lot of the times, to even realize this place did exist. So sometimes they were reporting this sort of incident well after it occurred in their real life. So when there was that large gap of time of incident versus time they reported it to Kaplan's group, oftentimes these reports came as a mix of truth, amnesia, and embellishments, unfortunately. Any wounds that they'd had healed by then, so there was no chance for Kaplan's group to document it with photographs. The most they could do is just catalog it. Now, Kaplan goes on to say, we try to calm and soothe the callers and reassure them that it probably won't happen again. Now, I suspect the reason he says this is because, look, if we're dealing with people who are vampires or who are deeply convinced they're vampires, some of them are out attacking people all the time to get their blood. Now, in essence, they're behaving much the way like a serial killer, a serial rapist, a serial criminal would behave. So their primary concern as that sort of victimizer is to not get caught. So as such, it seems logical that they wouldn't be attacking the same person more than once, and they probably wouldn't even be attacking in the same place more than once. This sort of strategy is elaborated on by some of the people who got an interview, and we will discuss that further along in the book. But yeah, so what we're dealing here with people who are serial attackers. So they're going to be methodical and thoughtful and strategic. They're going to be planning ahead, and we will find that not getting caught is a primary characteristic of those that they deem to be actual vampires. Okay, so the next section deals with self-confessed vampires and how they are dealt with by Kaplan's group. Kaplan says that the questions used to validate these callers cannot be revealed. And what I assume he means here is because of what he says what he says next is obviously we would be ruining the effect of these questions on any future calls we receive. So I think he's saying we don't reveal what our questions are going to be in advance because we don't want to give the caller time to prepare if they are indeed a prankster. So he says, suffice it to say, we ask questions that determine how much the caller really knows about vampires. This is where Kaplan's group separates the pranksters from the people who seem like the real deal. He says Transylvanian accents are immediately a dead giveaway that this person likely should not be taken seriously. It sounds very logical. And then he says we have questions and listen for sounds that help prove validity. Questions such as where are you calling from, which area code, which zip code, what's the weather like, are you at a private phone or a public booth? And I find this line of questioning interesting because what they're trying to do is catch you off guard. If you're just sitting in your living room having a prank call and you say you're calling from a suburb of San Francisco, from a phone booth, and he doesn't hear any sort of sounds of traffic or public behind you, and you can't answer which zip code you're in, you can't answer what the weather is like because you're sitting at your house in Indiana. This is, to me, a pretty clever way to try to immediately weed that out. So I think that that's something Kaplan's group probably learned over time to do as part of their preliminary process of ascertaining who seems real and who seems fake. Now, the problem to me seems to be any real vampire would actually be trying to conceal their real information, their location, their identity. And Kaplan does go on to say as much throughout the whole course of this book. He really hammers it home that one of their primary concerns is remaining pretty anonymous, or at least not being able to get identified by the police. So I think when, he asks, are you at a private phone or a public booth? Another point in asking that would be, well, somebody who is very focused on maintaining their anonymity, they very well, especially in the 70s and 80s when phone booths existed, they would more than likely go to a phone booth so that the call could not be traced back to them. And Kaplan goes on to say that while on these phone calls, his group is acutely aware of background noises such as giggling, chuckling, breathing, pauses that indicate less than spontaneous answers. So all these things would indicate that the person's a liar. All right, moving on to the face-to-face interview process. So after they've decided that a caller is a good candidate for further review, the next step is arranging an in-person interview if they can manage it. Now, he says if the caller refuses, there are two reasons for that. Either they're performing a hoax, or they're the real deal and they're too afraid to be exposed. So this is tough, right? Because at this point, when you're ready to set up a face-to-face interview, you've got the person telling you no. You say, if you're in the vampire research group, well, it's either 90% likely that this person is pranking me, or it's 90% likely that they're the real deal. But I'm not going to find out because they're not going to show up. So that's actually got to be pretty frustrating. Those who finally do agree to meet will undergo an intense 3-part interview and investigation in the presence of at least 3 staff members. Now, I believe they did that for safety reasons. And he said this process can last up to 2 hours, and it's an exhaustive list of questions, which I'm just going to read word for word right now. Part 1. Name, birthday. Did you graduate from high school? When? Why not? Did you attend college? Did you graduate? What was your major? Did you attend any trade schools? Since high school, what jobs have you held? For how long? What's your present occupation? Where have you lived and traveled? Have you married? Do you have any children? Part 2. This contains more intense lines of questioning aimed at actual blood drinking habits and knowledge of vampirism. Many of these questions are loaded on purpose, and the answers tell us more than the vampire may expect. Questions. Why are you here? What is a vampire? Why do you think that you're a vampire? How long have you been a vampire? Describe your first blood drinking experience. When did you first know that you were a vampire? Do you drink human blood? Animal blood? Both? What's the difference? Why do you drink blood? What does blood taste like? Do you prefer it chilled or warm? Do you prefer it mixed with another liquid? Something else? How do you store the blood? How do you feel when you drink blood? How do you feel after you drink it? Did you ever get sick after drinking it? Did you ever have hepatitis? How much blood do you drink at one time? How often do you drink it? Where do you get it from? How do you extract blood? Do you prefer blood from veins or arteries, and why? What's the difference? How do you learn to extract blood? How do you feel if you don't drink blood? Has your health changed since you've been drinking it? Has your appearance changed? What type of bed do you sleep in? What other foods do you eat? How much? How often? So you can see here that, like, if you were trying to perform a hoax, you would not have had time to think of the answers to most of these questions, let alone all of them. So I think they did a really good job crafting this line of questioning to really deduce quickly whether someone is full of it or not. Okay, and finally, part 3. Now he advances to just a physical examination of the supposed vampires. After they obtain a complete medical history from the individual, they request that the person put on a loose medical smock, leaving much of their arms, legs, and neck exposed for examination. And then they do a visual examination of the hairline and neck. They note any scars to indicate plastic surgery. I thought this was interesting because I think what they're doing here is trying to say, okay, well, if you're someone who's walking in here and you say you're 300 years old, but you look 30, we would like to at least see if you have plastic surgery or not to rule out whether that's a factor in your youthful appearance. So I found that interesting. They note the eye color and the eye's response to light, whether the eyes are bloodshot or not. They smell the breath. They look at the teeth, examine the arms, armpits, inner thigh, back of the knee. They're looking for needle marks. And I don't know why. I have pondered this. I don't think he elaborates on why in the book. I don't remember reading that. I don't know why they would be looking for needle marks. But they examine the skin condition. They have scars, discoloration, etc. They take the temperature, take tissue samples from the mouth, hair samples from the root, blood samples, 3 of them, before drinking blood, right after drinking blood, and several hours after drinking blood. So very thorough. And as such, this requires total cooperation and trust of the individual, which they did not always receive. Kaplan says in a different chapter that some of them would start to shy away when medical samples were requested because they really didn't want to be identified. Finally, they perform an evaluation of the overall physical condition, musculature, firmness, agility, aches or pains. And this 3-part examination always ends with the reassurance and promise to the individual that all information and findings from the interview will be kept absolutely confidential and not revealed in any way to anyone. So I find that interesting, right? Because you're dealing with people who might very well be out there killing people. So I find it interesting that they're saying they're not going to reveal any identities to anyone. You would think that there would be some legal or ethical conundrum there, but perhaps not. So apparently, the Vampire Research Center had a field investigation kit, and it included the following items: walkie-talkies, a map of the area, a first aid kit, candles and matches, a Bible, holy water, pens, paper, Star of David, a tape recorder, binoculars, a portable radio, geological hammer. What is that? Okay, and a crucifix, a camera, garlic. Each of these tools has a purpose. Most of them are self-evident. The crucifix, Star of David, Bible, holy water, and garlic all pertain to superstitious beliefs about vampires. These help us weed out the hoaxes and vampire-like people. If the supposed vampire reacts to any of these items in the classical Dracula dramatic type way, Kaplan says we're pretty sure we're not dealing with a true vampire at that point. I found this interesting. They rule out the dramatic reaction to religious objects. So, side note, I wonder if the Vampire Research Group ever used iron, because iron has been used for hundreds or maybe even thousands of years, I think, to ward off all manner of paranormal activity, whether that's fairies, demons, vampires, and apparently it's been quite successful. That's what I've read anyway. So I myself have a necklace made of iron, admittedly, to ward off anything that might come my way. So I myself have become superstitious after delving into high strangeness for long enough. All right. And just to conclude chapter 1 now, Kaplan says that the research they conducted was actually quite dangerous, and more than once he feared for his life, and the other researchers did too. He does talk about that later in the book in detail, and we'll definitely get into it. Kaplan says, some of our experiences have been downright funny. More of them have been spine-chillingly dangerous. In fact, I'm delighted to still be here and share our findings with you. So I'm just going to end this episode as Kaplan ends his chapter 1 because I like it so much. He says, "So get out the garlic, some holy water, a Bible or a cross, check your door and window locks. Take a deep breath and brace yourself. You're about to read a hair raising, true account of actual vampires in today's world."